I'm not going to introduce our panellists because I've asked them to introduce themselves. I've asked them to tell us how they've got to where they are today, warts and all, and the warts are the important part. So can I ask you to start, please, Liam?
Absolutely. My name's Liam Mannix. I'm a journalist with The Age at the moment. I'm a cadet journalist. I just got hired by The Age about 5 months ago from a small local paper in Adelaide called The Independent Daily. We were an online, rogues paper. We were all a bit cowboy. We were published from a little tiny office underneath a cinema, and there was this very large sewer pipe that ran directly past my desk just to put me in my place every time someone flushed the toilet, and you'd hear it was a bit grim. But it was a great paper. We set ourselves the task with 2 journalists of trying to beat the advertiser every day, and we consistently did, which probably says a lot about how terrible the advertiser are as well. But it was great. We got to be cowboys and break news and annoy people, and I had this wonderful editor who relished getting a call in from someone complaining about a story because he would just unleash a tide of F-bombs and then hang up on them. So I had a ball doing that. And while I was there, I decided I would experiment with some data journalism, some coding and some interactives, which eventually I spun into some work that won me a couple of Walkleys for the little paper. And I took those Walkleys and sort of showed them to The Age, and The Age said, all right, we'll have you.
Can I just ask where you went to university and what you did at university?
Yeah, of course. I grew up in Melbourne, but my parents moved me over to Adelaide at age 16. So I finished high school there and went and studied a double of journalism and international relations. But if I had my time again, I'd probably do a straight politics degree and maybe do a honours in journalism. I'm not sure that this whole 3 years was perhaps the right way to go for me.
Okay. What about the warts?
The warts, other than the sewer pipe, I don't know. I sort of feel like I've led a reasonably charmed existence.
Haven't made any mistakes?
I have made very many mistakes.
Any you can share with us?
Oh, God, these are some embarrassing ones. Look, perhaps the worst one, and I still feel quite bad about this, was I took it upon myself to write a piece about a motor race in Adelaide. It's called the Clipsal 500, and it's run in the centre of Adelaide, much as the F1 is run here. And when it happens, all of Adelaide's outer suburbs empty, and the motor racing crowd comes to town. And without casting aspersions on them, my female friends would report to me a very high level of a sense of unsafety in the city during this week, because these guys, get on the piss and they walk around and abuse women. Now, the advertiser wouldn't touch this story because this is the biggest thing in South Australia's economy. I found a women's group, the YWCA, who had put together a survey showing that some 70% of women in the city at the time of this race felt really unsafe because of this. So I decided I would build this story around this. And so I led with that, and then I spoke to a number of other groups, and every group, including police, the government, and other women's groups, denied that this was a problem. And, off the record, we got the sense that that's because they were a bit scared of fighting the biggest bear in Adelaide. But I ended up with this story saying women are reporting sexual assault, but they may not be, but here are a bunch of voices saying it's not true, which at the time I felt like I was doing the right thing in journalism, putting one voice with another. It was pointed out to me loudly and longly, and for this I greatly regret it, afterwards, that if you're going to write a story and say, here are some voices saying these people who are claiming sexual assault, that didn't happen, it probably was quite an offensive piece, reading it back. So I deeply regret that, and we issued an apology and did a lot of work on it afterwards. Mm-hmm. But yeah, there have been some mistakes.
Well, thanks for sharing that. It's really important that that we do understand this, and this is how we learn, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Beck, have you got anything to top that?
No, I accept your apology there. Should I introduce
full name?
myself?
Yes.
So I'm Beck Zajac. I came to journalism a little later in life, I guess. It took me a while to find it. I finished my undergraduate about 7 years ago or more in cultural studies and literature. And for my final year of that, I went on exchange to UC Santa Cruz, which is about an hour south of San Francisco in Northern California. And I really loved it over there. I also love my partner, who I met over there. So, which for both those reasons, I decided that I wanted to stay for as long as possible. And I found out that I could do an internship in a practical field, or in a practical internship in your field of study. And because my field was literature, I got an internship in book publishing. And I moved to New York for that, and then and that turned into a job as a book publicist. And I did that for about 4 years. Obviously, publicity is really different to journalism, but that was kind of my introduction to the world of media, and kind of gave me a nuanced sense of the 24-hour news cycle, because as a book publicist, you're trying to get your book in the news sort of narrative. So the sort of honed my news sense, which I feel like put me in really good stead for my journalism later on.
So broadening your skills.
Pardon?
Broadening your skills.
Yeah, so I guess at that point, I'd always kind of wanted to do journalism, but I didn't really have the confidence, I guess, to do it. So I was around it a lot. I was thinking about it. I was pitching to people, to producers and journalists. But writing really scared me, I guess. But then I eventually kind of decided to go for it and pursue that path, which kind of led to my partner and I moving back to Melbourne after about 5 years or so in the States. And I had I'd kind of talked to industry people through I was thinking of going to journalism school, and I'd seen that the way to do it was to create a journalism folio. So that was really what I set my mind to doing. So I wrote a little bit, firstly while I was still living in New York, doing some kind of Q&As with authors, because that was kind of the world that I knew. And then coming back here, I did a piece or two for New Matilda and Overland, just trying to get published and get used to writing. And then I found I finally kind of got the confidence to pursue the degree, and decided to do the master's at Melbourne. And for me, that really kind of provided the structure that I feel like I needed to build a really broad folio. So most of the work I've done has been through the course. So
do you think doing the master's has also given you further confidence and credibility?
Yeah, I think confidence, and I think kind of confidence in the idea that journalism is a practice and it's something you have to learn. And I think because we don't necessarily see that, and because it's not that structured, there's this mythology that you just wake up one day and you can just bang out, know how to bang out. Yeah, and some people can do that. But I think because I couldn't do that, and because that was difficult, I kind of thought, well, I'm clearly not meant to be doing this. It's not just flowing out of me. And doing the course and doing work through The Citizen, which is the online paper that comes out of the master's program, I saw how time-consuming it was to do the interviews, the research, to watch editors who'd been doing it for years take a long time to get through this process. So doing that really helped me build that confidence, and then just build more, solid practical skills, like how to interview, how to write a lead, and realizing there's some magic, but there's also just a craft that you can learn and develop. And for me, having that mentorship, I guess, through the professors there has been really useful, and to not just be doing it on my own. And they've also really pushed the students to get a really broad folio, yes, rather than just sticking to topics which you're comfortable with, to sort of look at doing a tech story or a business story, or things that might not be in your field of expertise. Like I think a lot of young people go into it and start doing kind of arts journalism or social justice type journalism, because that might be the young people I know are into that kind of thing.
Okay, can I just ask you about the warts? Any warts that you can?
The warts. Well, I don't know. I mean, I think for me, I kind of feel like I'm still doing it, then having the warts and
so
like
they're to come, are they?
Pardon?
They're to come.
Yeah. Well, I think taking so long to find it was a bit of a. I think for me, if I could go back and just tell my younger self to follow. I mean, I knew that I wanted to be writing, but I just couldn't kind of make myself sit down and have the kind of more dedicated practice. So I think if I could tell myself to do that, I would. And I also did actually a lot of community radio, which I think is an amazing way for people to get into, to get that confidence.
And was that honorary work? Community radio, was that honorary work?
Yeah, like voluntary.
Yeah, voluntary work.
Oh, sorry,
yes.
Yeah. Yes, so most of that whole spiel has been voluntary, I guess. No, not all of it, but I guess for me what was useful was that I'd done the publicity, so I sort of had that plan B. I had those skills, which I found that that there's demand in terms of what people will pay for. Publicity is still quite a valuable resource. So for me, having that, and that's how I got into Overland. So I also now work at Overland magazine, and for me, I got in there because I was doing publicity for them, and through that have gotten exposed to the workings of an online magazine. So because I kind of went backwards and had a bit of a career in something, it was useful while I've been learning journalism to sort of have that as a backup.
Good. Connor, what was your journey?
Yeah, cool. So my name's Tomas O'Brien. I'll preface this by saying I wouldn't call myself a journalist, but I would call myself maybe a media commentator or a media researcher. So I look at journalism, but I don't write hard journalism, perhaps the way that both of you guys do. My career, such as it is, probably began with the biggest wart of all. And this is deeply shameful to me, and something that luckily has been almost completely erased from the internet. But when I was 15, I was a News Limited columnist. That was the first job I ever got.
I remember this column.
This was
a good column.
Oh, I don't know. Luckily, they didn't put columns online. This would have been a decade ago, so they didn't put columns online. You can use something like Factiva if you... I know that it's there, but I really wish I could somehow petition for them to take these columns off. Anyway, so I did that for about 5 years, which is just the strangest thing, I suppose. You're kind of thrown in the deep end, writing for something that's completely not aligned with my own political philosophy. Got a lot of hate mail. Got virtually no training as to how to do this. So it's kind of an interesting position, putting a high school kid in and getting them to write these pieces. Anyway.
University?
I was in high school when I started doing it. Yeah.
And where did you go to university?
Oh, Adelaide University.
Yeah.
So I did an arts degree. When I went to university, got involved with student media. Ended up editing On D, which is a great experience. I also have an interest in design and shaping sort of the containers of the media. So as Liam has an interest in sort of coding and bringing that to bear on journalism, I have an interest in examining the way in which the container shifts how we understand written work and how we understand pieces of media and journalism. So I was designing On D, and then from there I moved to web design, working for a lot of publishing houses and literary journals, developing their websites. And trying to figure out how to reconstruct their sites to shift how that content is understood and improve the perceptions of quality, I suppose, and improve the shareability and things like that. And so, I've done a bunch of different things. I also set up an online bookstore startup called Tomely. And more recently, I've been involved I write a technology column for Kill Your Darlings. And I've shifted that into really looking at media, because I think technology and journalism are almost one and the same now, especially if you're doing a kind of meta-analysis. So looking at the way in which news trickles through something like Facebook is sort of my current obsession, particularly in terms of coverage of things like bigotry and differing political opinions.
What about regrets? Any regrets?
Yeah. First, I mean, it wouldn't be a regret, but starting off with News Limited may have not been a wise move. My biggest regret was when I was editing on D. And this is a trap that I feel like a lot of people fall into when they're editing something that they can also be published in. I was working with 2 editors, and I wrote a piece that was looking at the structure of the art community in South Australia. And I was looking at this idea that we have a kind of brain drain between maybe ages of 25 to 45, and the way that that affects the art market in South Australia. And again, I think it's very similar to what Liam was talking about in the sense, like, I think that there was something to my article, but I didn't research it properly. I also used language that wasn't vetted very well. So I was looking... It became somewhat offensive to people that lived in South Australia. Published it, and then the reaction wasn't great. And the problem was that essentially the piece wasn't edited because I was editing my own work. So I think that piece could have actually... I really regret the fact that I didn't force my other editors to edit that piece. And every time I'm friends with a lot of editors, and sometimes I'll see them... They have a deadline they need something up on, say, their website the next day, and so they'll bang something out, and I'll be like, "Are you getting someone to edit this?" So
you've learned from this experience?
Yeah. If you're an editor, don't assume that you have the ability to edit your own work, because you definitely don't.
Okay.
Student magazines are so dangerous. I wrote a piece about a terrible town in South Australia called Whyalla for my student magazine, and because nobody subs it and nobody reads your copy. You don't realise how offensive you can be. You're given total power to write these really offensive things. Yeah. And the local Whyalla newspaper read it somehow and put us on the front page. University wankers bag town. We got so much hate mail from this little town.
Is this why you both left South Australia?
Yeah, exactly.
Wasn't by choice.
Okay, Liam, where do you see yourself in 5 years' time?
Look, my long-term ambition has been to get to the Age. I always sort of dreamed of being there. I thought it was one of the great liberal papers in Australia, one of the great broadsheets. No longer that. It has a long tradition of high-quality social affairs, investigative journalism, and at the moment it's trying to be as innovative as it can, although it's still got some old world structures.
Very small.
It is becoming very small, yes. So I'm there now, and I've only been there a few months, and I'm sort of going, wow. My hope would be to see if I can carve out one of those careers that I think are fast disappearing in the media world, which is the career of a journalist who spends a fair bit of time at a paper, gets into a round and really understands it. I'd like to still be at the Age in 5 years.
At the Age, okay. What about you, Beck? Where do you see yourself in 5 years' time?
That's the question that keeps me up at night, Helen. I guess it's hard to predict exactly what kind of work I'll be doing in 5 years' time, especially given the amount this industry changes and how quickly. So I don't exactly know. I know I'd like to be doing journalism in some capacity. And I guess I have an idea of what kind of journalist I'd like to be. I guess I'd like to be the kind of journalist... I mean, news moves so quickly now that I feel like we only get, in breaking news, we get such a, kind of tip of the iceberg. And I feel like I'd really like to be the kind of journalist that's able to use all the new media tools that we have available now to really look at the context of issues and to have a more nuanced look at the current moment. So instead of just reporting on the current whatever has happened, say there's a rise in homelessness or something, actually looking at, what the cultural, social, economic factors are that are creating that issue, bringing in different voices, opinions about that issue, looking at the history of funding for that issue, not just the most recent funding development. I feel like with the bringing in a lot of voices of opinion. And I think with the new media tools that we have now, it really lends itself to that kind of expansive, nuanced journalism, because you can have hyperlinks, linking back to further research and data, and you can have breakouts with extra interviews with people, audio interviews. You can have photo galleries and slideshows and, interactive data maps and whatever, So I feel like that that's the kind of journalism I'd really love to be doing, more of those multimedia packages. And I'd love to be working in a newsroom, I think, because that would be, I feel like in terms of just developing my own skills, I've seen how valuable it is to work with people who've had years of experience. Mm-hmm. And so I think, that would be fantastic. And I also love working collaboratively, so I'd really like that. But, and making some money from it would be nice.
It's going to help.
No.
Okay, Connor, how about where do you see yourself in 5 years?
I guess there's two threads that I'm interested in, and I probably will remain interested in. The first is working within traditional structures or producing traditional work. So I'm interested in working on more long-form pieces and potentially like a full-length non-fiction work. That would be the more traditional thing that I'm interested in. But again, the economics of that are a bit shaky, so I don't suspect that would be where I'd be getting much income from. The other strain of stuff that I'm interested in is, again, like the containers, the shifting way in which we consume the media. So I sense that there might be money there somewhere in 5 years, but it's very hard to say what that would be. So I also do development and design, so I'd be interested in potentially creating publications that are exploiting whatever we have next, whatever kind of technology that is. Again, it's very, very hard to say what that would be in 5 years, because 5 years ago you asked someone what they thought the media would look like now, and they would have said something about potentially like flashy multimedia journalism on the iPad, or we didn't even have the iPad 5 years ago, on some kind of device. But what's actually happened is it's shifted towards listicles and BuzzFeed and Upworthy and essentially clickbait. And these what we think is going to happen in 5 years tends to not be, and sometimes it's where the money isn't where we think it's going to be. So whether there's something in 5 years that I can't quite figure out what it will actually be, and that's where we shift journalism to. I'd like to be there.
Liam, what do you think is going to have to change to ensure the health of journalism going forward?
It's a really interesting question, because unlike other people, I think that journalism is actually a good deal healthier than we think it is. There is a very significant threat to the way that we used to do journalism. The reality is the mainstream media is very knowledgeable that its content model is broken. Its business model is broken. But what's happening because of that, and because of the rise of the internet, and because of the rise of things that Connor is able to do, is it has lowered the barriers to entry to journalism. So I think we're getting these two really interesting forces at the moment. The first is the internet allows much easier entry into journalism. You're able to create websites and blogs, and beyond that you're able to create designs and so on. And that's helped out by the mainstream media being less dominant.
Videos. Yeah.
Absolutely. There's more room out there for other types of more niche journalism. At the same time, the mainstream media is aware that its form of journalism isn't working. And so there is an enormous push for innovation. When The Age recruited its journalism, its cadet class, it said we need innovators, because we need people who are capable not just of changing our newsroom, but of trying to try new things, bring experiments to us, try out things that might not work, but might work. So I actually find it a really exciting thing at the moment that is happening, because you're getting all this innovation from the bottom of media and from the top of media. So while there are less careers in journalism, and there's certainly less money, I am excited. I'm excited about the future of journalism.
Wonderful. Well, I think that's a wonderful, positive message for everyone in this room. Beck, how would you answer this question? Because you're working in a different space to Liam.
Yeah, like I'm glad he gave that positive message, because I might give the other side. But I think it's really useful to think about, ways to innovate newspapers to make them more suited to the digital environment. And I think in that sense, we are living through a really exciting time of change and innovation. But if I'm honest about what I think needs to happen to ensure a healthy future for journalism, I feel like we really need a shift in the way we perceive journalism as a society, away from seeing it as a business supported by the market and towards seeing it as a public good, the same way as we see healthcare, or the school system as institutions that are essential for our society, but that aren't viable without the public supporting them. And I've read a fair bit about the sort of various solutions to the crisis moment that we're in, which I would say that the amount of journalistic capacity that has just been lost in Australia is already a crisis moment. And these solutions sort of fall into two camps. One is saying that traditional media will find new sources of revenue. The other one is sort of saying that there'll be, those institutions will shrink, but there'll be startups to kind of take their place. But I feel like they both rely on this idea that the market will step in and everything will be okay. But, so far we've been in this crisis moment for some years, and no one's really come up with a sustainable model that will create, the huge, robust, well-resourced organisations that were, advertising funded, advertising sponsored media, general interest newspapers. So I've also been reading this book called The Life and Death of American Journalism, and what it talks about is basically it's a US focused center. It's based in the US, but they're talking about coming up with a publicly subsidized journalism network, I guess. So institutions that are run almost like universities, that are centres that these able to provide that kind of newspaper-like structure and basically money for young journalists to train them to become the digital savvy journalists of the future. And I feel like, in Australia we have this amazing tradition of public media, and we should be expanding on that. And
you mean the ABC?
Yeah, well, with the ABC, but I think, ABC, SBS, and because this book is in the US where they don't actually have that kind of tradition. And I think that, obviously this would take a lot of money, but...
Well, your comments feed beautifully into my next question, but before I ask that question, I'll just get Connor to tell us what he thinks about this.
I might diagnose what I think the problem is, but I'm not sure if I have a solution. I think Facebook and these social networks are a huge part of the problem. Essentially, you have, a lot of you are looking at newspapers, but it's fairly clear that most people are consuming the majority of their news through something like Facebook. And the issue with that is that you have an algorithm that's acting as the editor, and it's an algorithm that's accountable to no one. You end up trapped in filter bubbles where you're rereading the same content. You're never seeing anything that's outside of that bubble. You also tend to be trapped into reading content that is clickbait or that's somehow manipulative, and it's almost impossible. I mean, everyone's probably aware of how terrible it feels to continue to read these clickbait pieces and never be able to escape out of this trap. I was talking to a staff writer at BuzzFeed about this, and they're very vehement that they're not producing clickbait, but their business model is troubling because it's the most successful new media business model and appears to be the only one that's working, which is producing clickbait or content that's easy to essentially, in many cases, you will trawl through legitimate publications like The Age, or in America, The New York Times, then you'll copy that content, add some snark, a level of snark onto it, potentially dumb it down a bit, put it in a listicle form, publish that. and then that will pull all of the attention away from the legitimate journalists that are actually doing the hard work to actually produce that news. And then the other somewhat brilliant idea, but deeply troubling idea of something like BuzzFeed is the collapse of editorial and advertising. So they receive virtually all of their money. They do run ads, but the majority of the advertising, the revenue comes from articles that masquerade as, advertisements that masquerade as articles. And we kind of, advertorials. Exactly, and we kind of ignore that because BuzzFeed is seen as this trivial organisation that produces entertainment, essentially garbage news. So you have, sponsored posts by the NBC to promote the Friends 10th anniversary of Friends. That was one of them. But the fact is that they're moving into what they perceive as hard journalism, and they're putting journalists on the ground. And I spoke to this staff writer and asked them, well, if this is your business model and you're trying to move into hard news, does that, how are you making revenue from your hard news? Are you going to have the same revenue model where you're collapsing, you're essentially allowing someone to pay to run a particular story? And they said, oh, no, we don't have a revenue model for that yet, which is very troubling because it suggests that is exactly what they're going to do. So that seems like a huge problem. Even if we do have, even if the New York Times does manage to stand the course, and even if The Age and like a few of these other legitimate old mastheads stick around, the structure of like the way that we consume news online allows them to be leached off, and it's really, really troubling. I'm not sure whether... I think the only hope is that en masse consumers will tweak to what's happening and somehow stop visiting these sites, but it's almost an addiction. So I feel like it is the consumers of the news that need to figure out what's happening. And
right. Okay. Yeah. Well, what I'd now like to know is how do you think all these changes are impacting on our democracy?
Well, I was thinking about this as you guys spoke, and it occurred. I was just sort of wondering if, in all of this discussion about the decline of media models, we're looking at the means, not the end. The point of journalism is to have an informed democracy, an informed state. Absolutely. So maybe the question is less, okay, we've got problems with journalism's business model. Maybe the question is more, are citizens as informed and as engaged as they were before? And I think you could almost mount an argument that citizens are at least more engaged. The birth of social media allows people to get their voices out in ways that, perhaps weren't happening before. Are they more informed? Perhaps as well. I mean, news.com.au, who are our competitor, and BuzzFeed, do chase clicks. And to get clicks, they have had to find ways of writing stories that get people to read them. If you go to those websites, yes, there is a lot less worthy reporting than you might see on a New York Times, but they're still going to throw up a story about Ebola, and they will write it in a way that they have focus tested the hell out of, and that you will read it. They'll say, here's 10 things to know about Ebola, and they know that the psychology of the human mind is that it loves lists.
Yes, because it's not only newspapers, it's radio and television where we get our news and information from. Well,
that's right. I mean, television is still the dominant medium for journalism. And while TV doesn't break a lot of news because of its format, numbers are holding up really well for news. And, there's been reinvestment in television news in the last few years. So I just wonder, I haven't seen any data on it, but I wonder if our populace... What impact the decline of journalism's media model has had on the engagement of our populace?
It's not only news either, it's the current affairs programs that we listen to and watch. What's your feeling, Bev?
Well, I would argue that we're less informed, and that getting even less and less informed as journalism is hemorrhaging jobs. I was in the US when the GFC hit, so a lot of the local newspapers...
2007?
Yeah, so a lot of the local and metro newspapers were kind of crumbling at that time. And I remember reading some research about done in cities where the local newspaper had, I think it wasn't gone, but it had significantly shrunk down. I think it was in the city of Baltimore. And they were looking at, so there was a lot of news, but 85% of it was was just unfiltered PR, and a lot of it was just aggregated content of what was being produced on that traditional media. So I think that we would, in this world where as there's less news, it's not, if in smaller newspapers, it's not like there'd be less news. I think that news would just be unfiltered PR, and we're already seeing that in terms of these big media. So we'd get like Shell Oil news and Commonwealth Bank news and, you know, pharmaceutical company news, which I think feeds into your point. And, you know, and these companies already don't need newspapers. They're already essentially working as media organisations. So I think they would be the only newsmakers. And, you know, I think that's where my idea of public subsidy feeds in, just because I think we need money for this. We need resources, and, you know, the government's hustling now to find funds to, you know, save us from what they're saying is an existential threat to our way of life in terrorism. But from where I stand, like the disintegration of the business model that has supported our free press for centuries is a real threat to our democratic way of life. And I think we should all be concerned about it. I think, you know, if in a foreign country, if a totalitarian government comes in and dismantles the entire free press, you know, we call it an atrocity. But if it happens slowly due to market forces, you know, we just are meant to sit back and call it progress. So I think
it's a bit like the boiling frog.
Yes, exactly, the boiling frog. And I think it's definitely a threat to our system of self-government, and I think people are less informed, and I think that for democracy to function, you need people participating in it, and for people to participate, they need to be informed, and, you know, newspapers are what essentially inform people, and I think that kind of model of the listicle doesn't necessarily it doesn't give people necessarily the information they need to know to be, you know, for a self-governing society to work.
Okay. From where you sit, Connor, what do you feel?
I'm actually conflicted about this, because I think that in some senses people are more informed, and in other senses they're less informed. I think they're more informed in the sense that when you're out on the street or on a tram and you see people on their phones, often they are reading news, and it's very hard to say, but it seems as though people are consuming more news now than they were before. It depends on how you define news, though. But so they become deeply informed about things that interest them. So, for example, you see rallies being organised about refugee issues or particular issues, and the people that are at these rallies often are extremely well informed, presumably better informed than they've ever been about these particular issues. The problem is that they're not informed more broadly, and they're not informed about, this is my huge bugbear, they're not informed about the opposition to whatever the issue that they've taken up is.
Like
so
climate change or terrorism? Or...
Yeah, so they, you know, it's self-selection bias. If you believe something, then you're going to follow down that rabbit path, which is what the internet really allows you to do very, very well. In terms of climate change, I mean, look, I think climate change is real, but the fact is that if you can't understand why on maybe perhaps a psychological level someone is unable to believe that climate change is real, then you can't engage in a dialogue with them. The science is obviously on the side of climate change being real, for example, but people believe that it's not real. And then you have these two people that are there's no dialogue, because, you know, people that believe climate change isn't real are subscribing to Facebook pages or news outlets that are just confirming their own biases and vice versa. And you need to be able to understand what your opponent or what someone that doesn't share your views, you need to at least understand why they've come to that position so that you can more fully understand your own position. And this is what I'm finding the very confusing thing about whether, you know, this situation is more democratic or less democratic. There's very little dialogue now, and media outlets tend to be moving off in a particular direction because they recognise that as soon as they identify a particular tribe of readers, they can more easily market to that tribe. So you have something like Daily Life, for example, which does, that's going on a more old-fashioned business model of selling ads, but that demographic is very, very profitable because it's, it's young women that want to read things that are political and serious, but it's pushing a particular worldview that has its own problems because it moves further in a particular direction, and this happens in every direction. I'm not just picking on them.
Well, the Guardian's a great example, isn't it, of a newspaper that have said we've got a totally honest political view. We're hard to the left, and doing that means that they get a guaranteed group of readers. And it's also really clever these days because the left is very much a Twitter group of readers, so they're able to get enormous social media traction. So, yeah, I think Connor's right. I think there is now a real profit that news organisations see can be made in being more ideological. And Fox News perhaps pioneered this, the idea that you can make a lot of money out of being very biased.
Although I would argue that, I think the Guardian's unique now in that it's got a left-leaning ideological bias, you could argue, but I don't think it's new in that it's the new thing to have in Australia to have an ideological bias. 70% of our media is owned by News Corp. So I think the fact is that every newspaper is going to have an ideological bent, and so that's why you need a diverse media environment, and a robust media and lots of institutions that are working well. But I think it's true. Obviously, the specialty kind of publication is the thing that seems to have found success in this new subscription model. So it is worrying to think that we don't have a platform where we're all coming together.
Can I just go back to your point about the fact that, and this has been proposed before, the fact that the media actually could be not-for-profit organisations. People could set up not-for-profit media organisations, and there could be a formula where they're funded by the government. Do you have any more thoughts on that idea?
Well, I think that, that's what I've been doing a lot of reading on that, just because I can't see other solutions that are useful. That could work in the same way. And I think there's argument. The argument against it is that, some people say that you can't, that in some ways this is going to be propaganda or something like that. But I think because in Australia we have this amazing, the ABC's always ranked as like the most trusted news organisation or something like that. And I think in that way we've seen how you can have a charter of independence that allows it to have an editorial independence separate from its funders in a way that corporate media doesn't have. And in the reading I've been doing, I don't know, I haven't read everything on it, but I think that I was reading that there is evidence that in countries where they have more heavily publicly subsidised media, so in the Scandinavian countries, I think Norway, Denmark, Sweden or something, have the most publicly subsidised media. They have the most robust kind of political, they have the most sort of adversarial media, and they have the least information inequality. And they're often ranked. The Economist does this study every year called, it's like the most lists the countries in terms of who's got the most democratic country, and they have different factors. And The Economist is by no means like a left-leaning publication, but they always rank these Scandinavian countries that have more heavily publicly subsidised media near the top. So, to me, the other idea is to have philanthropic people, philanthropy, but I don't see that having enough really to resource it. Perhaps
a mix of it.
Yeah.
I think we'll now open it up for questions from the audience. So, okay.
My background is in science, and I think especially in the climate change sort of area, I'm often concerned about how poorly the public understands science. Do you think, I guess probably, well, it's for anyone on the panel, but I'd be particularly interested in Connor's view, do you think there are any sort of formats that make it easier for a non-scientific audience to understand scientific content?
I think Liam might be able to answer that as well, but I think data journalism is really interesting. That would probably be my answer, but like whether that appeals to the people that you want it to appeal to, who do you who do you want to understand, and will they ever be able to understand? I feel like there is like a lack of a publication that is able to present scientific news or more objective news that can kind of present itself as accessible, that isn't like a popular science magazine, because that has its own readership. I don't know. I mean, what do you think?
Talking to our online team, the problem that we have is not so much, how do you elucidate these complex facts? It's how do you get people to read the story? We can write, great climate change stories, bang them up. People don't click them, which is a big problem. I think an element of that is that people have got bored of the debate. People feel like there's not a whole lot new to be said. How do you solve that? I think perhaps you could look at sort of the way that BuzzFeed and the way that news are doing this. You don't need to give people enormous reams of information, which is perhaps the way that the old media did it. We like to write these huge stories because we had huge amounts of pages. The reality is now attention spans are a lot shorter, thanks to the internet age, and we can watch that. We can watch how people are paying attention in real time, which is exciting. So I would almost see that the way to tell that sort of a story would be by reducing the complexity down. Here are 10 things you need to know about climate change. Let people understand it that way.
I was just going to... There's a principle known as bike shedding, which is quite interesting when we consider the state of journalism. And this idea of bike shedding is essentially that it uses this example of this complicated... I can't exactly remember, so I might be making this up a little bit, but it's essentially this complicated construction site, and then there needs to be decisions made about all of these very, very important structural things that no one quite understands. So they have this really long meeting, but all of the most complicated things are just immediately agreed upon without any discussion. And as soon as it gets to, this bike shed, I think this is it, but anyway, they spend hours and hours debating this because it's the only thing that they understand, even though it's the most trivial thing. And that's the real issue that I find with like a lot of journalism, is that we devote the more trivial something is, the easier it is for people to understand, and the more we feel the need to debate it. But the more important and fundamental the things are, it's harder to have that debate, because you can't be sure that people will be able to actually engage on that debate on the same level, because there's so much prior knowledge required. And then you end up with think pieces about TV shows. While we have these major social problems, we discuss whether girls needs more racial representation, and it's kind of like, well, why don't we look at the real world and the way in which issues to do with race there? But it's too complicated, so we need to... I mean, is there a way to kind of play off that in order to trick people into engaging more deeply? I don't know. Hopefully someone will figure that out.
Okay. Beck, do you have a thought on that?
No, I don't think I have anything to add. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah. It's pretty
Okay, I think.
What do you think about
excellent? It's an excellent question. It's really applicable to climate change. How scientists get across the crisis that we're in.
Thanks. We've heard a lot over the last couple of days of this conference that the Australian journalism industry is dominated by men, older men, white, straight men. Does this impact the way you navigate this industry, and do you see that changing at all anytime soon?
Liam?
Yikes. Look, I don't want to speak for the age there, because I think the Age's editor can probably speak for himself on that topic. What I would say is that in the newsrooms that I've interned in, and I've been in a range, I've been in lots of ABC, I worked briefly for the ABC before I did this. Certainly in those newsrooms I did see an element of gender bias. It's very interesting coming through J school now, because certainly my class was female dominated. I think it was about 75% females. And certainly all of the junior reporter roles at Adelaide's metropolitan papers were held by females. So there is going to be an interesting demographic change, maybe in about 10 years, when this big group of, this big female cohort starts to hit that senior management role, it'll be interesting to see how media changes as that demographic changes. Me personally, I should check my privilege here. Unfortunately, I am a white, straight male, so I have not felt the impact of it personally, but certainly speaking to other female journalists, they tell me that there is a significant impact and that they feel it strongly.
Beck, you?
Yeah, so as a queer Jewish woman, I'd say I've noticed this. I think hopefully what Liam's saying turns out to be true in that all these talented young women turn out to be the managers of tomorrow, but from what we've seen in the past is that often somehow those management roles still get maintained by these few straight white men who've made their way through. I think that when you go into journalism, it's an industry where there's a lot of roadblocks that you see. You get told that there's no jobs. You get told that you have to be a certain type of person to make it work. And I think to get through that, you need a certain amount of confidence. And I think, women, queer people, people of colour are always going to struggle more with having that kind of confidence. So I think that anything you can do to lower those barriers and to make it more open and more of an open environment are great. I think also journalism takes a lot of risk, involves a lot of risk taking. And I think that there's research I've read that, women do tend to struggle more with that kind of risk taking professionally. My partner she did her undergrad in music school, and we always used to joke that, there'd be a really competent, female guitarist who would be too shy to get up and play the solo, and then there'd be some guy who, would do it and do like a really crappy job, but because he did it, like everyone clapped and no one really noticed that it was bad, and he then developed through that experience. And I think with journalism, it's the same. When you go into a story, you really need to take sort of a risk. You're not going to know what's going to come out. You're not going to know what you're going to find. You're not going to know what the sources are, and it can be really scary. And for me, I know that's a really hard thing to keep getting over. And I think traditionally for women, that can be more of a struggle. And I'm doing a project now with two guys from the two friends and students, fellow students from the course, and we always find when we meet to talk about how it's going, like I'll be like, oh, I think it's really worrying. We don't have any information. We don't really know what's going to come of this. Like we should throw in the towel. Like I don't know if we can keep doing it. And they'll be like, oh no, I'm really confident it's going to be fine, And so we always joke like, oh, we need both. And I always try to channel that. So I think that's more about, I guess, how I think it affects people. But I think anything you can do to alleviate those factors is going to be a way to make it a more even playing field in the future, and to get those women in those top roles.
What have you noticed, Connor?
I don't have much experience with what's happening in the newsroom, but my experience would be within the literary journal space and the festival space, where I guess there's a lot, I don't know actually, whether there's more consciousness of having a diverse representation of voices, particularly at a festival though. Writers' festivals, the director tends to be very, very conscious of having this diversity of voices, which I'm interested in to know whether that, Liam, you're saying that more women are coming through as cadets, whether that's a result of just more women trying to enter that field, or whether there's more a level of consciousness at
I think
sort
it's
of
a
management.
level of consciousness.
Because I think that is fairly important. Again, I can only look at festivals, but I know that the difference between a festival where the person is conscious of making these decisions and the difference when someone is not is so obvious. There's been festivals where people just don't take this into consideration, and you end up with panels that are just ridiculous because the people just have no diversity of experience. And then you call out the festival director and they just say that they didn't understand that was something that was their job. And so I think making it clear that in the media that it's the job of people in management to make those decisions is...
What I'd like to suggest to the questioner is that probably if you looked at politics, medicine, education, and certainly law, you'd find exactly the same situation. Another question down here.
Yeah, we've talked about listicles, and there seems to be a skepticism about them across the board. But given the fact that the attention span of people is reducing significantly, how relevant do you think long-form journalism is, and what are your alternatives? What do you suggest as the alternative, a legitimate alternative?
Ooh, that is difficult. I think you're right. I think if we accept that people's attention spans are shorter, and we accept that newspapers are going to be thinner, and we accept that people read more on newspapers than they do online, which we know to be the case, it does put long-form journalism under significant threat. So yeah, absolutely. One of the positives, I sound like I'm being all positives today, is this new trend towards what they're calling content resurfacing. The idea is that newspapers and magazines have enormous archives of depth because they've been publishing long-form pieces for 100 years in some cases. And every day we, create the news anew, but long-form holds up remarkably well. Mm-hmm. So there's some really exciting experiments going on, pioneered probably by longform.org, which is a great resource. But news media is actually doing this now and sort of jumping into the idea that, right, our print archives are full of this really great stuff. Instead of paying a journalist to write a new story, why don't we get this back up and resurface this, because this is outstanding content. So, I think it is troubling times for long-form journalism, but it'll be interesting to see how resurfacing comes along in the future.
Mm-hmm. I don't know. I think it's just good to remember that it's not as if really high-quality news ever sustained itself purely from payment from people. It wasn't like there was this huge audience that used to pay for it, which sustained it, and then that audience is gone.
And newspapers have always been sold at a loss.
Exactly. They've always been, and they've always been subsidised. It just so happened that they were hooked to this idea of advertising, which funded them. So I think it's just good. I don't know what the solution is now that we don't have that subsidy from advertising, but I think it's good to remember that it wasn't as if there used to be a time where people did want to pay more for this good quality journalism, and now they don't because they're dumb or they're stupider, or I don't know if there's I guess that we do sort of see evidence that people have less attention span, but I think there's still, I know there is this thirst for news and there's this thirst for information out there, and I think we need to work out a way to provide that. We need to work out a different way to fund it, because I think people have never wanted to pay for it in the way that needs to be sustained. To get a good investigative piece, this issue's kind of arisen again because of the debate about Late Line on ABC, but to get an investigative news piece together Liam, you must know from at the Age, I assume, just the hours it takes and the resources it takes to get that one article, are just unending, and I think people have never really realised that or valued that and paid for it. So,
well, I spoke about how much I love small publishing, and I worked for a little tiny newspaper. To be able to come into the Age and my editor just said, you've got 2 weeks to write this story. That's a resource that isn't going to happen at a smaller publication, and it's a resource that we shouldn't lose. So, absolutely.
Please thank our panellists who have just been excellent today with some wonderful ideas and thoughts. So please thank them.